Oh no, are we doing this now? I read some semblance of this. I just didn't delve into it. Xbox Insider says Hi-Fi Rush is coming to the Nintendo Switch. Is Microsoft turning its back on its fans? Is this really what we're doing? Is it turning your back on your fans to like release a former exclusive on another platform? So Clobril says, okay, this is in response to the rumors that they're bringing Hi-Fi Rush to the Switch. No one is saying you have to share or care for the concerns of Xbox fans have. That's totally fine, but there are logical reasons not everyone is happy with this direction, and that has nothing to do with the plastic box or console wars or whatever. I'm tired of reading this. If you think this is about the console, you don't understand anything. I guess at the outset, maybe before I read all this, I should just say my opinion. I think it depends when we're talking about this, what perspective you're taking. Microsoft's approach to gaming, love it or hate it, I'm just trying to tell you what it is because they've made this very clear to investors at least. Their approach is to approach it like they approach the Microsoft suite, like they approach all the other software cells. Microsoft at the end of the day is a software company and a software distribution company. That's where they make their money, is by getting software and then selling it and distributing it. They don't make their money from selling hardware. They don't make most of their money from selling consoles or anything. They make their money from distributing software. So they're taking the same approach with gaming, or at least they're starting to try to. That's what Game Pass is. The goal of Game Pass eventually is to have a platform where you can play games through their platform anywhere. So whether you're on an iPhone, Android phone, or a PC, a Mac, if you're playing on PlayStation or Switch, wherever, they want you to be able to play their games through their platform while paying them the money because they're a distributor at the end of the day. So this approach to start bringing some of these formerly exclusive games to other platforms, it perfectly lines up with their goal of being a distributor first and foremost. I understand why Xbox fans might not like it and why it might frustrate them in comparison to how Sony's been doing things. But when you look at it from the perspective of Microsoft's approach, hopefully you can understand why they're doing it. Is it like the best approach to win the console war? Maybe not, but I don't think Microsoft views this as a console war. Like they view it as, we are a multi-trillion-dollar company and we're building a platform to distribute games that Sony can't even begin to approach and touch. We're doing our thing. Sony will do their things. I just think they're approaching it totally differently. But let's see what else they're saying. Because as everybody in here knows, I'm not really a console fanboy, so it's a little weird for me to try to put myself in that headspace. But let's see. A brand and investment in ecosystem is defined by its games, by its library, and the moment you bring experiences to competitors, you'll give up a bit of that identity, potentially piece by piece. You'll actively take away value reasons to get into that ecosystem in the first place. Again, the platform, the ecosystem is Game Pass and is Microsoft's game distribution. It's not a console. It's not playing on the Xbox app. It's playing their software, buying their software. And beyond that, bringing it to the Switch, if that ends up being what it is, I don't think Xbox really views the Switch as a competitor. Like, I think Nintendo has always been in this weird place where they kind of sit on the outside, and a lot of people are going to have their Switch and they're going to have their PlayStation, or they're going to have their Switch and their Xbox, or Switch and PC, but it doesn't really overlap. Like for most of gaming history, at least over the last like 20 years, it feels like Xbox is here, PlayStation is here. There's this like middle area. Maybe we also put in PC. Maybe we just say like PC is also kind of in here. And then Switch is, I don't even know how you do it, but it just feels like the Switch is over here. And like the Wii and Wii U are over here. Like, it's just its own thing, because a lot of people feel like they have to either buy their PC, and that could be their main platform, or their PlayStation, or their Xbox. And it's like, maybe sometimes there's overlap. Maybe some people own all three. Maybe some people own just like an Xbox and PlayStation. Other people might own both of these or whatever. There's a little bit of overlap here and there, but Nintendo has always just kind of been on the outside doing their own thing. And it doesn't really come into the equation that if you have a Switch, you're giving up one of the others. It doesn't really feel like a direct competitor. So I'm not sure if I agree that it's a strict competitor from their perspective. From here, it snowballs. I guess I should say, if they're bringing all of their Microsoft or Xbox exclusives to PlayStation, I can see how you'd feel like they're actively harming their own ecosystem, or I guess discouraging people to get into their ecosystem. And that's true. They aren't going to buy an Xbox, but it still follows in line with their overall strategy, which is to just sell and distribute software. Like, that's all they're trying to do. Let's see from here. Snowballs, you take away reasons to get into the ecosystem. Your ecosystem potentially shrinks. Your ecosystem potentially receives less third-party support. And suddenly you as an Xbox gamer are directly affected by these decisions. You'll ignite discussions when first-party game XY is coming to the competition. You'll inevitably hurt the value of your own brand. Such moves directly contradict some of the statements you as a company made in the past. Some of that is already happening today. But it's awesome. More players get to play Hi-Fi Rush. Again, you seem to fail to understand what the concerns are even about. Of course, more players are playing the games is awesome. Anyone would agree with this. What even is this kind of argument? It also would be awesome if players get to play Helldivers, Splatoon, God of War, or Mario. That's an obvious non-statement applicable to literally every game ever, big or small, but there are good reasons none of these games are on Xbox. The point is, this is a one-way street. You won't see Nintendo or Sony experiences on Xbox devices or service, period, or you cannibalize something that is unique to Xbox for more sales. Yes, you get more money short-term, but you lose other values, which cannot easily be attached to numbers. I think all of this, though, is almost like immediately knocked out when you consider that PlayStation has been doing this very same thing by bringing their games to PC, granted, years after the fact, sometimes 1 year, sometimes multiple years after the fact, but they've started bringing it to PC to broaden the pool of players. And yes, there's been a lot of PlayStation fanboys that have been pissed about it, but it seems to have been largely good for the PlayStation business. Like, not only are they selling more copies of these individual games, but they're also like growing the fan base of those games. And because they're coming later, like a year after launch, it encourages those players, if they like play God of War on PC, which a great example, Jacob, Mr. Cow in chat right now, my editor, he just started playing God of War on PC. He's loving it so much, he's actively considering getting a PlayStation 5 just to play Ragnarok. That is exactly the goal of it, to get you to buy it on PC and then bring you into the ecosystem. Like that's how it works. That's how it works. So I just don't see how throwing a fit over this really makes a lot of sense when you're saying, see, Sony doesn't do it, but they do. And they're actively doing it, you know? Leo, also the big difference, Sony and Nintendo don't have a Game Pass, so you can't play their exclusives anywhere like you can with Microsoft titles. Yeah, and I mean, if they bring Game Pass to the Switch and you can stream Game Pass titles to the Switch 2 or whatever they call it, that will still help Xbox. Because again, it's not about hardware, it's not about playing with the Xbox controller, it's about distributing software. That's the whole point of their business. And if you're like, well, I don't think that that's sustainable. I don't think that that could work. I don't think. We're talking about Microsoft. Microsoft, a multi-trillion, pretty sure multi, right? I think it's like a $2 trillion company, $2.76 trillion. They are a multi-trillion dollar company. I think they know what they're doing. I'm sorry, Mr. Guy on Twitter. I don't think you know how the business model is viable, you know?
Xbox has to learn to play hardball. Good guys don't always win, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I would say that's why they've spent at this point, what, $80 billion all told on acquisitions in the last decade. Like, they're going hard. They're going hard. And we're barely seeing the benefits of all of this. Like, it's going to be probably another 3, 4, 5 years before we really start to see the benefits of like buying Activision. There are too many cooks in the kitchen at Xbox, and Xbox wants to cook everywhere these days. I feel like the org itself doesn't really know what it wants to be. So of course they fail to communicate that properly to its audience. I'm a hardcore Xbox user, and there are days where I don't understand their strategy, their decisions anymore. If I don't understand how can they expect 2 billion of gamers to understand them? Xbox already is both first and third-party publisher today, and I think people will need to get used to the latter becoming even more prominent at Xbox. If you try to serve everyone, you'll end up serving no one. At the end of the day, this is still just a rumor. Xbox hasn't done anything yet. All of this talk is just theoretical, just to keep that in mind. I know some very amazing things happening to Xbox users this year, including one larger surprise. The biggest challenge Xbox faces is themselves. I think respectfully, Clobril, I read this as just a fundamental misunderstanding of what Xbox is trying to do. They are not approaching, and they've made this painfully clear to investors, they're not approaching the gaming industry or market in any sort of similar way to how Sony has approached it or other studios and publishers have approached it, because they've lost that fight time and time and time again. Like, they've shown that they just can't really compete with PlayStation, at least in the near term. PlayStation just has it figured out already, and they've got a ways to go before they can figure it out. But rather, what Xbox is trying to do is to try and build a software distribution platform that people subscribe to, that becomes the one-stop shop where you pay your 15, 16, 17, whatever it is, dollars a month, and you get access to a crazy huge library of games that you can play. And once players become accustomed to it, you're already seeing it where people are saying, the game's fine, but I'm going to wait till it goes to Game Pass. That is exactly what they want. That's the whole goal. That's the whole premise of the entire pricing model. Like, that's the goal, is to have it so when a publisher drops a game and it does okay, just wait 6 months and they'll bring it to Game Pass. They get a signing on bonus. They get paid based on the hours played by players, and the gamers win because they get a game at a non-egregious price while also benefiting from a otherwise massive library. The publishers win because they get to make more money on a game that otherwise would have been a flop. And the only people that really lose are like the more typical hardcore fanboys that are looking for the more classical PlayStation approach. Yeah, just like movies, I'll just wait till I can stream it. Yeah. And like, you don't have to like this, to be clear. I'm not saying like this is how I would have liked the industry to go, but this is what it is. Like, we're just describing reality here. Okay. Like, this is how the whole system's working. This is how they've built it. And I do think that this is the best way that Xbox could approach it. I think this strategy makes sense. Doing what they've been doing through the PS4 and Xbox One generation, doing what they did in the 360 generation, which was a totally different time. It's just shown time and time again that I don't think that they can really compete with PlayStation at their own game. So they've made their own game. They just created their own thing, and it seems to be working for them. But players need to stop thinking about this in the same way that they've thought about gaming for the last decade, which is like, wait, but you're going to take your exclusive game and then put it on the Switch? That's crazy. For one, PlayStation's been doing that, so it's obviously not that crazy if you're going to try to do the console fanboy thing. But also, like, this is the point. The whole point is to get people to buy software at the end of the day. And if Microsoft owns an ocean of content and can sell it to players in various platforms, that serves their means. Like, that's the whole point. Would this decrease the AAA stinkers? I think the goal is that this would change it. And Phil Spencer actually had a really good breakdown of this that came out during the FTC hearings, where he said the gaming industry went through a pretty transformational phase about 5 years ago, as digital copies of games started to spike in popularity, as games and the cost to produce them started skyrocketing, and as subscription models became a mainstay. A lot of big publishers realized that their margins were shrinking. So what they did is, instead of trying to produce a bunch of smaller AA sized games, hoping that those would be successful, they went and they tried to invest all of their money into singular massive titles, hoping that those would blow up and make hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, making up for all of the hundreds of millions they spent developing it. A great example, there's actually a handful of these flopping, but probably a very good recent example that might be memorable would be a little game that you might have heard of from Square Enix, Forspoken. This game was developed with tens upon tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, especially when you factor in marketing. Millions and millions and millions of dollars poured into it. And as we know, it was a total flop, lost ridiculous amounts of money. And it's because like investing crazy heavily in big AAA games or quadruple A games can work if the game ends up being popular and a hit. If you spend all that money developing Elden Ring 2, it's probably going to be good and the game's probably going to make stupid amounts of money. But when you put it with an inexperienced team, or you put it on a new IP, or you have crappy writing that ends up just tanking the game in the public sphere, you're going to be screwed. And that's what they learned with Forspoken, is like it just ended up hemorrhaging money in every facet. Another example would be, say it with me now, you guys know where we're going. You guys know what's happening. Saints Row. They spent millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars rebooting this franchise, expecting it to be the saving grace for Volition. It was going to be their big comeback. It was going to make them tons of money, and this was going to justify the studio being silent for a good long while. And it ended up flopping. So it's super high risk, very high reward if it works out. Same with live service games. Now, what is one of the giveaways for when people get into a high risk, high reward mindset? Usually is an indication of desperation, right? You see this in individuals, and you also see it in companies and businesses. When individuals become really desperate, you start to see them maybe take extreme risks they wouldn't otherwise take. They might go and take the last $500 that they have and they bet it on black, hoping that it can make enough money to pay off the loan shark. You know, they might go and go crazy, trying to overwork themselves or push themselves to try and get the promotion or whatever. Like, you start to see this all the time. When people get desperate, they seek out the high risk, high reward thing. And in the context of game development and publishers, it's very similar, where they're seeing that their classical approach was not working. And part of the problem with it, and this is what Phil Spencer brought up, because of the ease of publishing nowadays, self-publishing, big publishers like I guess you could say like an EA or like a Take-Two or some of these other companies that used to publish third-party games all the time. Like, they're not having these small indie developers approach them anymore. And they're not willing to give up half of their sales forever to get fronted the money for development, because there's a lot of independent investors looking to get into game investing. And then there's also self-publishing, which is more viable than ever. So they don't have to rely on those people anymore. So the publishers are like, well, we're not making money on those little indie games and the AA games that we used to publish all the time. So I guess we have to start making our own games and going for the high risk, high reward thing to keep afloat. And that's what they started doing. And when it flops, it flops really badly, as we've seen in the last year with some of these huge titles that go nowhere and lose tons of money. So with a Game Pass type of pricing model, this harms third-party publishers even more, which is good for indie devs, because the indie devs can approach Xbox and get their game on Game Pass day one, and it could be remarkably popular. We've also seen a lot of games end up on Game Pass that wouldn't otherwise have ever seen the light of day. Probably the best example of this was Pentiment, which came from Obsidian. And this game, rave reviews. Overwhelmingly positive, 10 out of 10s from all sorts of journalists. And this is a game that never would have seen the light of day if it was being published normally, because it's just not the kind of game that would normally sell very well. But on a Game Pass, it can find success because people see this and it's like the art style, the design of the game, it's just not going to be the type of game people are going to front $20-$30 for. But if they can try it at no added cost, they'll try it. And then they see all the rave reviews and they're like, actually, this is really good. This is really good. So they end up trying it and they end up agreeing that it's a 10 out of 10 and it's amazing and they end up loving it. But this is a kind of game that never would have existed otherwise. And so it's just a great example of one of the strengths of something like a Game Pass that can benefit one party and totally screw over another. But this is business. This is how the world works. Like something that really helps this group screws over this group, and that's just how it is. There's no such thing as a win-win-win situation in business. There's always somebody getting screwed. So for Xbox approaching it this way, I think it makes perfect sense. I think it makes sense why they're approaching it this way. They're doing something very different because playing PlayStation's game has not worked. And people like Clobril making those big long posts upset that they're potentially bringing Hi-Fi Rush to Switch. I think they just fundamentally misunderstand Xbox's new approach to the industry, which is to distribute software full stop. And if that means they bring Call of Duty games to PlayStation for $70 a pop, or you can play it on Game Pass day one at no added charge, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. I just think a lot of Xbox fans are finally in the position where like Xbox is buying and making all these games that are actually like Hi-Fi Rush, really well reviewed, very popular. People loved it. And then Xbox is taking that and distributing it. And they're like, no, we have our big exclusive. We have a popular, highly reviewed exclusive. Keep it exclusive. Screw those other players. They need to buy into the ecosystem. They have to feel what we've felt for a decade while Sony and Nintendo had these amazing games that we couldn't play. And it's just, that's not how it's going to work. It's not Microsoft's game. They're not trying to play the PlayStation game. They're not trying to play the Switch game. The Nintendo game. They're doing their own thing. And I think it's going to work. I really do. I mean, it's already, I feel, working. I think it's pretty clear that it's working. Well, I think, they would like to see games like Starfield launch to positive reviews and keep high reviews long term. They would like the performance to stay really high, but we shall see.